Did you know that the Bible speaks of three heavens? It's a concept that might sound distant, almost like a riddle, a mystery hidden in the pages of ancient texts full of deep meanings. But what if I told you that these heavens are not just part of some distant celestial landscape, but something that can directly impact your life today, right here, right now? That changes everything, doesn't it? Have you ever stopped to think that in our daily routine, there are moments that make us feel like we're being called to something greater, something that transcends the ordinary? Have you ever felt that inner pull, like you're being drawn to a higher plan, a deeper purpose? It might be a moment of intense prayer, an episode of faith that touches you deeply, or even that unexpected moment when something happens that stirs your soul in a profound way. All of this has to do with these mysterious heavens. And here's the big question. What are these heavens, really? And how do they affect our spirituality? They're not just related to life after death, nor are they the images we have of a faraway paradise. No, these heavens are much closer than we think, far more connected to who we are and what we face here on earth. They are tied to our spiritual experience, to our calling, to our internal struggle, to our journey. I know you're probably thinking, but what do the heavens have to do with me? I understand the doubt. After all, in a world where the rush of daily life, concerns and personal challenges take over, thinking about something as grand as heaven can seem distant, almost unreachable. But it's precisely here that the secret lies. Sometimes it's in the small internal shifts, the little decisions, that we begin to see how the heavens manifest in our everyday lives. And as mystical and hard to grasp as it may seem, the truth is that these heavens are far more connected to our practical life than we think. Each one reveals a layer of our spiritual journey, an invitation to live more fully, more aligned with the divine. Now, to start unraveling this mystery, we need to understand that each heaven represents a different phase of our journey, a distinct aspect of our walk of faith. And as we move forward, you'll realize that although each one has a unique role, together they interweave, challenge us, and lead us to a deeper experience with God. But before we move on to the next point, I want to leave you with one last question to reflect on. Have you ever had a moment of connection with something greater, something that made you feel there was more to the world than what your eyes can see? Perhaps that sense of transcendence is the very doorway to understanding the heavens that until now have been hidden. Stay with me, because this journey is just beginning. Soon we'll enter a heaven that's very close to us, and maybe you never imagined it was so near. Now let's talk about the first heaven. The first heaven is the one that, in a way, is most within our reach. It's the heaven we see every day when we look up. The blue sky, the clouds spread like cotton on the horizon, the sun shining, or even the stars that enchant us on the clearest nights. This heaven is like a natural canvas, painted by God every day before our eyes. And although we can look at it and only see the vastness of space, there's something deeper that this heaven represents. It's not just the backdrop for our lives. The first heaven is a reflection of the physical plane, of God's creation, and it reminds us that everything around us, what we can touch, feel, and see, is part of a great divine plan. This heaven is where our lives unfold, where everything that is material, physical, and tangible plays its part. But the story of this heaven goes much further than our eyes can capture. While it offers us beauty, it also places us in front of a vast field of challenges. It's the place where we face our limitations every day. It's where our daily struggles happen, where the difficulties of life manifest in a concrete way. Whether it's the loss of something or someone, internal battles, or the storms of life, the first heaven reveals itself as the space where we are tested, where our strength is challenged. Have you ever stopped to think that this heaven could be a reflection of your own faith? When we face the difficulties of everyday life, Isn't what's at stake not just our ability to survive, but our ability to endure with faith? How do we respond to life's challenges when we feel overwhelmed by physical, emotional, and spiritual limitations? Could it be that the heaven we see every day, with its vastness, invites us to look at our struggles from a new perspective, knowing that behind every cloud there's a divine purpose? The first heaven is not just the backdrop where we face challenges. It's also the field where we put our faith into action. It teaches us that even when we are surrounded by difficulties and limitations, God's beauty and power are still revealed. There is still hope, still something greater guiding us. Now, with this reflection, perhaps you're asking yourself, but what happens when we look at this heaven and can't see beyond the clouds? What happens when we feel lost? When the struggle seems greater than our faith? This question leads us to a deeper and more distant heaven, and that's the heaven we'll talk about now, the one where spiritual warfare happens and where we find strength to face what we often can't. See? Let's explore the second heaven, the invisible battle that takes place and how it directly impacts our walk of faith. Now things start to get a bit more complicated. The first heaven, with its clouds and shining sun, is visible, tangible, almost palpable. But the second heaven, that's different. It can't be seen with ordinary eyes, yet its presence is undeniable. It exists in the spiritual realm, in the dimension where battles occur without anyone noticing, yet with a profound impact on our inner lives. In the Bible, we find some passages that reveal a bit about this second heaven. In Ephesians 6:12, for example, Paul warns us, saying, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, and the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." The apostle isn't speaking of a physical war, but a battle that takes place in an invisible reality in the spiritual plane. This invisible war is a battlefield where forces of good and evil clash, and often we are pawns caught in the middle of this struggle. Sometimes we can't see what's happening, but we can feel its effects. The overwhelming doubt that hits us, the temptation that entangles us like an invisible web, the moments of fragility and despair. These are clear signs of this spiritual war. They are the invisible weapons of evil trying to weaken us and steal our faith. But what does this have to do with you, with your daily life? How do you deal with spiritual challenges? When you face that inexplicable sense of discouragement, or when doubt invades you, or when temptation seems to surround you from all sides, have you ever stopped to think that, in reality, you are right? In the middle of a battlefield, these difficulties don't appear out of nowhere. They're not just coincidences or random life events. They could be manifestations of this invisible war that takes place in the second heaven, where evil tries to destabilize our faith and pull us away from God's purpose. And if you've never considered the idea that your faith could be the real battlefield, maybe it's time to reflect on that. Now here's the question. How can we fight a war that we can't see? And what do we do when the struggle is so intense that our faith begins to waver? The answer may lie in understanding how these spiritual battles work, and how, even without seeing, we can act with wisdom and strength. But to go deeper into this invisible battlefield, we need to look to another heaven, the third heaven, the place where spiritual warfare is resolved, where God's presence gives us the strength to continue, and where, finally, we find the eternal purpose that keeps us steadfast. Let's now explore this third heaven, which takes us to a place of peace, where the confrontation with evil can be overcome. And now, we come to the third heaven, the most sublime of them all. This is the heaven that goes beyond what we can see or touch, beyond what we can comprehend with our limited minds. The third heaven is where the physical and spiritual realities meet and become insignificant in the fullness of God's presence. It transcends all the dimensions we know because it is the place where God Himself dwells in His indescribable glory. Paul, in 2 Corinthians 12:2-4, speaks about his mystical experience of being caught up to the third heaven. He describes this experience in a way that leaves us speechless. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, and I heard inexpressible words which it is not lawful for a man to utter. This vision Paul had went so far beyond his understanding that he chose not to try to describe everything he saw because words could not capture the magnitude of it. But what can we learn from this heaven? The third heaven is more than a physical or spiritual place. It is the constant reminder that we have a true home, one that is not of this world. It challenges us to look beyond the material, beyond the struggles we face here on earth. The third heaven calls us to eternity, to a direct and intimate relationship with God. It reminds us that though our lives here are temporary, our final destination is eternal communion with the Creator. It may seem distant, right? But in reality, the third heaven is closer than we think. In moments of silence, when we disconnect from the noise of the world, perhaps we've already experienced something that connects us to this celestial reality. Have you ever had a moment when suddenly you felt touched by a peace that cannot be explained? Perhaps it was a moment when the presence of God filled your soul so deeply that you forgot about time and space. A peace that goes beyond human understanding, that envelops you and calms you, even when everything around you seems chaotic. This transcendent presence is a glimpse of what the third heaven represents. It gives us a vision of what it is like to be in perfect communion with God, where all things are made new, where pain and suffering no longer exist, where peace is complete and eternal. Have you ever stopped to think that those moments of deep peace could be a reflection of what awaits us in that heavenly realm? But what does the third heaven have to do with our daily lives? How can this place of peace and divine presence affect our choices, our faith, and even our relationships here on earth? Well, these questions bring us to a crucial point. The third heaven is not just a place we go to when we leave this world. It's also a reality that we can begin to experience right now. And that's what we'll talk about next. How can we bring a piece of this heaven into our everyday lives? How can we live with our eyes set on the eternal without losing sight of the challenges and struggles we face in the first heaven? Now here's the point where everything starts to make sense. How do these three heavens connect? How can we understand the relationship between the physical heaven, the spiritual heaven, and the celestial heaven? And most importantly, how does this affect our practical life here and now? It's very easy to fall into the trap of seeing life in separate compartments, to think that what we do in the physical world, in our day-to-day life, has nothing to do with what happens in our spiritual life, and that somehow the celestial heaven is far removed from our current reality. But the truth, and perhaps the greatest secret of our walk, is that everything is intertwined. Everything connects. The first heaven, the second heaven, and the third heaven are not isolated spheres, but parts of a single path that leads us closer to God. The first heaven, the physical heaven, calls us to live wisely in the material and physical matters of life. It teaches us to care for creation, to deal with what we can see and touch, to respect the body, relationships, and responsibilities we have here. Often we think that material life is something to be ignored in favor of spirituality. But the first heaven reminds us that the way we treat the world around us, how we handle our work, others, and our finances has a direct impact on our relationship with God. The way we act in the small things also prepares us for what is to come. The second heaven, the spiritual heaven, teaches us to fight for our faith. It is the arena where we wage our inner battle, where we face the forces that try to draw us away from God. The second heaven calls us to realize that not everything we face is merely a matter of physical circumstances. Often, the difficulties that arise, the confusing thoughts, and the feelings of doubt and fear have a deeper origin. Spiritual warfare. is real, and how we respond to it defines our growth in faith. Here we are challenged to be vigilant, to pray without ceasing, and to put on the armor of God, as Paul teaches us in Ephesians 6:10 and following. And finally, the third heaven, the celestial heaven, is where the full presence of God dwells. It reminds us of our eternal purpose and our true heavenly home. While we live in the first and second heavens, the third heaven is what gives us hope and perspective. It challenges us to look beyond what is visible, not to lose ourselves in temporary battles, and to focus on what truly matters, our communion with God, our eternity with Him. The third heaven is the ultimate goal, the promise that sustains us throughout the journey. But how do these three heavens connect then? How can we integrate the physical, the spiritual, and the celestial in our everyday lives? The key is understanding that one does not exist without the other. The first heaven prepares us for the challenges of the second heaven, and both point us toward the third heaven, which is our true home. Each of them has something to teach us and guides us toward a deeper understanding of our faith and our purpose. Have you ever thought that your life may be influenced by these three heavens in ways you can't even imagine? Perhaps the difficulties you're facing in your day-to-day life are not just physical issues, but manifestations of a spiritual battle. Or maybe, as you look at your priorities and decisions, you realize you need more focus on the eternal, on the things that are unseen but have an eternal impact. And this leads us to a big reflection. How can we live more consciously of these interconnected heavens? How can we integrate this vision into our daily life? Well, the answer lies in the path of spirituality. When we begin to see life as a journey that crosses through these three heavens, we start to live with a new perspective, a deeper vision, and one more aligned with what God has for us. And this understanding prepares us for the next step. How do we practically live this connection between the heavens in our everyday life? But before we move on, I want to leave you with one more reflection. How have you been living in relation to these three heavens? Are you focusing too much on the physical, or perhaps forgetting the impact of the spiritual battle? What does the third heaven have to teach you about your purpose right now? These are questions that, when answered, guide us toward a life of greater wisdom and faith. And it's about how to bring this wisdom into our everyday lives that we'll discuss in the next topic. Now it's your turn to reflect. After exploring these three heavens, it's time to take a deeper step. Think for a moment and ask yourself, where am I right now? In which of these heavens am I most present? What does this mean in your life? Sometimes we get so focused on the material and physical things of the first heaven that we forget our struggle goes beyond that. The hustle and bustle of everyday life, responsibilities, concerns about work, health, and the world around us, all of this occupies our minds. But have we been paying attention to the spiritual battle taking place in the second heaven, in our minds and hearts? By focusing so much on the physical, on what we can see and touch, do we fail to recognize that something invisible and much more powerful is happening around us? Sometimes the battle isn't external, but internal, within us, in our thoughts, doubts, and temptations. And the second heaven is crying out for us to wake up and see that. On the other hand, have you been lost in the internal battles, focusing so much on the spiritual difficulties that you've forgotten the eternal promise of the third heaven? Perhaps, as you face the spiritual challenges in your life, you have stopped looking to the celestial horizon. The third heaven is the place of your true home, your true homeland. It's not just a distant destination, but the eternal reality that awaits you, sustains you, and guides you. So, the question is, have you been giving attention to what transcends the physical and spiritual, to what goes beyond the battles and the temporary difficulties? I want to hear from you in the comments. How do you see the connection between these three heavens in your life? Have you noticed how each one of them can affect the way you deal with daily challenges, or how they can guide you toward a greater purpose? Has understanding this interconnection between the heavens changed the way you think about your spiritual walk? And more importantly, are you ready to seek a deeper understanding of your faith? Are you ready to live with more balance between the physical, the spiritual, and the eternal? The journey between the heavens begins now, inside of you. And the key to understanding this connection lies in how you handle your everyday life, how you perceive the battles around you, and how you keep your focus on what truly matters: eternity with God. If you're ready to take your faith to a new level, don't forget to share your reflections in the comments. Let's explore this path of transformation and spiritual deepening together. And of course, if this video spoke to your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next content. Let's continue this journey together. The three heavens are not just abstract concepts or theoretical ideas belonging to some distant world. They have a real, tangible, and transformative impact on our daily lives. Each one of them brings a practical lesson that, when applied, can change the way we see our reality and how we live our faith every day. In the first heaven, the physical heaven, we learn to live with wisdom and gratitude for the material blessings we receive. Every moment of sunshine, every breath, every resource God places at our disposal is an opportunity to recognize His goodness and create a more balanced lifestyle focused on what truly matters. When we look at creation around us, whether in nature, in the people we love, in the work we do, the lesson is clear. All of this is a gift. How can I be faithful in caring for what is physical and material? This heaven teaches us that the way we handle the things God has entrusted to us here in the physical world is a fundamental part of our spiritual walk. So what does this mean in practice? It means we should live with more awareness, more respect, and more gratitude for the blessings we have. Instead of letting ourselves be consumed by the worries of daily life, we can look to the first heaven and remember that everything we have is a divine gift. Whether we are working, taking care of the house, doing grocery shopping, or interacting with people, everything can be done with a new perspective. With gratitude, with wisdom, and with a heart that understands that, at its core, we are caring for God's creation. In the second heaven, the spiritual heaven, we are called to be vigilant and strengthen our faith. The second heaven reminds us of the invisible battle that takes place every day, and it invites us to become spiritual warriors. Spiritual struggles are not something we can see or touch, but they are there. In our attempts to resist temptation, in our moments of doubt, in our falls and our victories, this heaven calls us to fight with the weapons of prayer, faith, the Word of God, and constant vigilance. How can we apply this in daily life? The answer is by staying alert. Instead of ignoring or minimizing spiritual attacks, we need to recognize them and face them with wisdom. When you feel the weight of doubt, anxiety, or temptation, remember that it's a spiritual battle. And in that moment, you have the power to turn to spiritual weapons. Pray, meditate on the Word of God, seek help and fellowship to resist. In the second heaven, we learn to be brave, to strengthen our faith, and to constantly seek the help of the Holy Spirit. Finally, in the third heaven, the celestial heaven, we are reminded that our soul longs for something eternal, something greater than everything we see here. The third heaven is our true homeland, the place where we will be with God forever. It challenges us to keep our eyes fixed on eternity, to live according to our eternal purpose, and to understand that the struggles and joys of this life are only temporary. How do we apply the third heaven in everyday life? The key is to live with an eternal perspective. This doesn't mean ignoring the needs of daily life, but rather making sure that each choice and action reflects a deep desire to please God and live according to His will. When you are tempted to worry about temporary things, look to the heaven and remember that eternity awaits you. This brings peace amid chaos, strength in adversity, and a clear focus on what truly matters. You can start applying this in small, daily actions. When you work, think about how you can do it in a way that glorifies God. In your relationships, seek love and patience, reflecting the peace that comes from heaven. When anxiety knocks on your door, remember that heaven is your true homeland, and everything you live here is preparation for something much greater. This gives meaning to every moment of life. So then, how can you live more connected with these three heavens? How can you practically apply the teachings of the physical, spiritual, and celestial heavens in your life? Remember, this journey is not about living in just one heaven, but about integrating all three into your walk. They complement each other, intertwine, and guide us to a life that is richer, deeper, and more aligned with God's purpose for us. These heavens are not distant. They are here within our reach, ready to transform and guide us. And so, we've reached the end of this journey through the three heavens. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a reflection. How will you live from now on with the awareness of these three heavens? They are closer than you think, and understanding this connection can transform the way you face difficulties, challenges, and even the peaceful moments in your life. Now it's your turn. Which of the three heavens has spoken to your heart most? What can you change in your daily life to live more connected to these heavens? Leave your reflections in the comments. I'd love to hear how this has impacted your faith and your understanding of your spiritual journey. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now. Turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any more transformative content like this. Share this video with friends, family, and anyone you know who will be touched by this message. Remember, your spiritual journey is unique, but we're not alone. Let's continue together, striving to live a fuller, more connected, deeper life with God. May the peace of God guard your heart and mind.